Hello, I'm Sal Gualteri, the digital media specialist in the Williams College Sports Information Department, and I am joined by Jason Hehir, the director of a number of ESPN films, including the '85 Bears, the Fab Five, HBO documentary Andre the Giant, and of course, the director of The Last Dance, chronicling the 1997-98 Chicago Bulls, who were on the quest for their sixth championship in 8 years. And Jason, I know it's a busy time right now, so thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
You got it, man. Let me just pull this table a little closer. I'm still getting the hang of the whole Zoom interview thing. Happy to be here, man.
So you studied political science and English at Williams. How does that translate into you working in sports?
Political science and English was, I knew that I wanted to do something where I could kind of write my way out of any right or wrong answer, which science and math, there's a hard answer for everything. And I did not want to be backed into that corner. That Williams is a really challenging academic place. And I was not in there for my grades. I didn't have bad grades, but I did not get in there for my grades. I got in there for my blazing 78-mile-an-hour left-handed fastball. So yeah, I wanted to take a major where I could just have to read and write and not have to just try and stay out of a science lab and out of math exams and all the things that I was not especially good at in high school. But I was a huge sports fan my entire life. I grew up the youngest of three boys, and that's all we did. From the time I could walk, I had a ball or a bat in my hand, and played baseball at Williams. Sports was always a big part of my life there. My friends and I, that's what we did for fun. Was either we weren't actually playing baseball, we were playing wiffle ball or tennis or football, throwing a football around. It's always been about sports. So I've reached out to a guy named Sam Flood, who was class of '83 at Williams. My senior year, asking for job opportunities at NBC Sports. And I ended up working at NBC for 3 years, met Bob Costas at NBC and went with him to his show at HBO, ended up staying at HBO for 7 years. And then I started my own company. Geez, I guess it's 12 years ago now. In a couple of weeks, I've been on my own for 12 years.
So I just want to scale back. We're going to go back a little bit to when you were a kid, and we'll work our way towards your career. So you talked about being sports a huge part of your life. You were a ball boy at BC for the basketball team. I know that your mom worked there, and you had the pleasure of running into Doug Flutie and Gerard Phelan a few days after the Flutie Hail Mary. What do you remember about that? What was that experience like?
I was Doug Flutie for Halloween that year to get the of how much I idolized that guy. I was 8. I was too young to be the ball boy at that point. I just was spending a lot of time at BC. My mom worked there, so I loved going to campus and walking around campus. It was a safe place for me to be. My mom kind of I knew where things were, and I could be 8 years old and still walk around unchaperoned, and everyone treated me so well. As a little kid walking around the college campus, I was like a little mascot. And that was like Flutie Mania in Boston at that point. My mom forgot something at her office one night, and I went in with her, and she was in her office doing something, and I went to the student phone book, which is called The Source. It was back then. It was tactile paper phone book. Looked up A B C D E F Flutie. Went down to Flutie. There was Darren Flutie, who was a freshman at that point, and then Doug Flutie. His name and number were right there. It was a 4-digit extension because he was on campus. So I just dialed the extension and he answered the phone. Now this is the Tuesday. He threw that pass on a Friday night, and this was the Tuesday after that pass. So it was right. He was like maybe the most famous man in America at that particular moment. And I asked him if I could come down to his dorm on the other side of campus and get his autograph for my brothers as an early Christmas gift. I mean, I wanted to meet him, but I needed a reason. I thought I was 8. And he said, "Come on down." I went into my mom's office and I said, "Hey, I just talked to Doug Flutie. We're gonna go to his dorm." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" But she drove me down. I mean, my parents they encouraged me a lot to do things like that. And being the youngest of 3 boys, I had to kind of learn to stand up for myself and ask for what I wanted. So went down to his dorm, and Phelan was his roommate. That's the guy who caught the pass. It was his roommate, and they were there with a couple other football players. They were watching themselves on Good Morning America from the day before. There was one VCR on campus. It may have been a Betamax machine, and there was only one. That's the only way that you could watch something that happened the day before, is that someone had to videotape it at audiovisual AV at BC. They taped it. They went and got the VCR, brought it to their place, hooked it up, and then watched themselves. And they were watching themselves, and that's how I got it. But that's my entire life has been spent with athletes like that I admired. Because when I was ball boy for BC, I was constantly around. I was in the locker rooms with them. I was on any bus road trip, they would take me on the bus with them. So I kind of have been groomed for the job that I do now from the time that I was very, very small, to be comfortable with these athletes and to know how they interact with other people and just to know how to interact with them.
I read that story and I was like, I thought that was so funny. I had to bring it up. I'm going to stick with football. So in your time at Williams, you called Williams football games for WCFM, and you, of course, called the famous 1997 Williams Amherst football game. What do you remember, not just about the game itself, but the electricity before the game, what Williamstown was like on that day? Just what do you remember about that day?
Homecoming is always a big day, whatever the game is. And it's such a gorgeous time of year at Williamstown, and such a unique place to be for a game like that. Just like that kind of, it's great to be in an SEC game or one of those huge 100,000 person stadiums and packed house, but it's also just a unique, really cool experience to go to a small college New England football game. It's almost a time machine. So that particular day, we had only called, it was my roommate, Matt Marvin, and I, who I'm still very good friends with. Matt now is running NASCAR, and he's one of the head producers for NHL at NBC Sports. He also reached out to Sam Flood, the same guy that I reached out to, and he stuck with Sam for the duration. So he's been there for a while. So he and I, there was only one, this is how long ago it was, there was only one set of equipment on campus that you could call a game with for WCFM. And the soccer game was going late. It was in overtime. So this guy, Steve Epstein, who was Sam's class, 83, he came to call the game with us. And there was only a phone that you could call the game from. We weren't going to hand the phone back and forth to each other. So we told Steve, just call the game in the first half, and we'll come up there with the equipment in the second half when they hand it off to us from the soccer field. Well, Marvin and I spent the first half in the parking lot, tailgating with everybody else. So we were already pretty deep into a case of Bud Light by the time we got up to the office. You can if you listen to the broadcast, you can hear us emptying out the full beer cans from our pockets of our coats onto the table in front of us when we walk in the room. So it was fun. We actually had proper equipment for that second half. And Steve, I've never met him before and never saw him again, but we had a good time with him for those couple of hours. And obviously the ending was what it was. I think I'm still regaining my voice from that day.
So if it's all right with you, I have audio from that final call. If it's all right with you, can I play it?
It might not be all right with my dog and my girlfriend, but I'll listen to it, sure.
Here we go, a 26-yard field goal.
If you're a religious person, start praying. Let's go. Please make this.
Ball down. Kick up.
It's good.
Helmet. They win. Williams wins. Williams wins on a field goal. In 2 seconds.
Believe it.
Williams wins.
God.
Oh, Williams wins.
This is the best thing I've ever seen in my life.
Williams wins.
Yes. A 2-point. Yes. 2 seconds remaining. Incredibly, the most amazing athletic content. Unbelievable in the history of Williams Amherst. I highly doubt it's ever been this exciting.
This is the greatest game in Williams Amherst history.
Unbelievable. Enough.
It sounds like 3 different people, 3 separate calls.
I know, it's just kind of like mayhem. I listened to it leading up to the game this year, and I was like, it seemed like chaos up there.
Well, someone called it unprofessional, and they're literally right. We weren't being paid for those things. We had we didn't know. We would take the program up to and that wasn't the only time that we tailgated before we did those things. There was only a few games we did that year, but we would get there just in time for kickoff with the program that you would have if you came to the game. And we'd be calling the game, just looking on the fly at what number was who and who. We knew nothing. We were just there to have fun and to make our friends laugh, really, who were listening back at home. So, yeah, it was, like I said, My voice is still a little bit scratchy from that day. Marvin's voice is that's the loud one that you hear, and I think if you play that a little bit further, you would hear him say that the best part of all of this is that Matt Marvin and Jehir brought it to you live. That was Marvin's personality. He still is kind of he's like a pro wrestler trapped in a NESCAC student's body.
That's a timeless call. So you talked about Sam Flood, how you got your start, NBC Sports. Talk about, you were there for 3 years. Talk about what you did there. What were your roles?
I was a PA. Basically, wherever Sam wanted me to go, I was going to go. So he put me with, back then, NBC had a lot of the major sports. So they had just lost the NFL, but they still had the World Series. They still had French Open, Wimbledon, the Breeders' Cup. What else did I work on there? But NBA was their main, that was their crown jewel. So I was a PA in the studio for graphics. So I was a guy who would be in the truck with a headset, or in the control room with a headset on, getting yelled at by producers because I spelled somebody's name wrong, and then I would take that headset off and then go to the edit room, and I was a tape PA, they called it back then, because it was all tapes for the feature producers, and that's where I learned, how to edit and how to put together a story visually. So it was a 24/7 job. You can ask my roommates from my first few years in New York. I mean, I never could go out. I was working constantly, and I think that the base pay was $110 a day, so I was making like $550 a week before taxes in New York, which is no good. But it was like getting paid to go to grad school. It was incredibly exciting for me. I mean, that's all I wanted to do was work in an environment like that. And I was going to 30 Rock every day and being paid to do something I love to do. So it was grueling and tiring. I'm about 210 pounds right now. I got down to like 165 just from pure stress when I was there. My parents came to see me and they thought that there was like a legitimate problem, because I was just so gaunt and exhausted and stressed out. But it was worth it. It was an incredible experience.
And you got to collaborate with Mookie Wilson and the 10 greatest moments in baseball history. I know you were able to make strides with the higher ups on that. I mean, I am a diehard Met fan, so for me to hear that, that's
Mookie. I think Mookie was the first interview I ever did, and I lied. The thing was, the guys I was working for were having babies at the time, so they couldn't go on these road trips, and I didn't know that they got to do all these interviews for all these. If they did a halftime feature story about Tracy McGrady, oftentimes it wasn't the talent going to do the interview. They would send a producer out to do it, and then the talent would voice it over and put their name on it. So I lied to these guys and said that I knew how to do that, and I had absolutely no idea how to do that. I figured, how hard could it be? You just sit across from the guy and you ask him questions. There's more to it than that, but not much more than that. I had to learn, camera speak and everything. But Mookie Wilson, I was a diehard Red Sox fan, of course, being from Boston, but I was also a huge Met fan because I was a Gooden Strawberry guy. Those were my guys. It was Jordan, Gooden, and Strawberry. That was it, my wall to wall. And then like Bird here or there, or Roger Clemens, but it was really Gooden, Strawberry, and Jordan. So I was kind of ambivalent about that 86 series. I wanted the Red Sox to win, but I wanted Gooden and Strawberry to do well, which made my dad told me to kindly watch in a different room if I was going to cheer for them. I got the picture real quick, but I interviewed Mookie, right at first base, right at the first base line where the ball went through Buckner's legs. That's what we did that interview.
I read that too. I was like, that's awesome. Because as a Met fan, that's just music to my ears. So you leave NBC after 3 years and you go to HBO. You're there for 7. What did you do at HBO?
I went there because Bob Costas was at NBC at the time, and Bob was just launching his own show at HBO. He still worked at NBC, but he had his own show at HBO, which at the time was called On the Record with Bob Costas. And I met Bob through being a PA at NBC. I was the PA for his main producer, a guy named Bruce Kornblatt, who's also a Boston guy. So Bruce was going to run Bob's show at HBO, and they asked me if I wanted to come over there. So I worked over there on that show. And then when the season was over on that show, I had nowhere to go. And they asked me if I wanted to work on Inside the NFL. So I did that and just kind of leapfrogged my way around, and then eventually got a staff job there and started a show called 24/7, which followed around 2 boxers. The first one was De La Hoya Mayweather, for their fight in 2007. And then we did Hatton Mayweather. And then my bosses there told me that I think they thought this was a good thing. Get used to this because you're not going to be doing anything else for a long time. And that's the worst possible thing that I could have heard. I wanted to do different stuff, keep doing those, but do different stuff. So shortly after the second one, which was in December of 07, I left in May of 08 and went out on my own.
And you went out on your own and opened JMH Films. Talk about what was behind that.
There's no JMH Films is about the size of the laptop that I'm talking to you right now on. It's not like we have a brick and mortar place with a full-time staff, but it was necessary in order to run a production. The networks had to give someone a budget to run the production through. So JMH Films is where these, not the Jordan Project, that's through another company, but I've done 85 Bear. Most of the 30 for 30s I did with through JMH, and Andre the Giant was through JMH. It's not the most terribly creative name for a company because it literally was just like day of. I had to write something down on the line in order to have a tax ID number, and those are my initials. So it was actually JMH Productions at first, and then my mom Googled it, and apparently JMH Productions is a prolific porn company, and so she looked up the titles of the movies. It was like, wait a second, and she called me like almost choked up, like, oh my God, this is terrible. So make a quick switch, call the state of New York and switch productions to films. But yeah, that's what I've been doing ever since. The first thing that I did was a doc about Jose Canseco for A&E. I spent 14 weeks with him. And as is often the case, a documentary about the making of the documentary probably would have been more interesting than the documentary itself. And then I did a lot of work for the UFC, the same 24/7 formula that we used at HBO. The UFC wanted to do that for their fighters, so I did that. And then in 2010, I got approached by Jalen Rose to do the Fab Five.
So Jalen approaches you about the Fab Five. What was that process like? Obviously, you couldn't get Chris Webber. You got the other four. You got Steve Fisher, Brian Dutcher, Perry Watson. You were able to get the president of Michigan and the AD. Did you not getting Chris Webber for that end up helping you out in the long run for that film?
Yeah, because the original plan, if we got Chris and Jalen had every intention of getting him, they were very close from the time they were kids, and Chris just never agreed to do it. The original plan was for the five of them to be sitting at like a steakhouse and kind of recounting from their perspective what it was like. And the budget involved in getting everybody to New York for that and shooting it with 5 cameras and everything, it would have blown the budget out of the water, so we wouldn't have been able to interview the other people. We never planned on interviewing Dugan Fife and so many of the guys, James Bosco, guys who were second stringers on that team. But Chris not participating opened up a lot of money in the budget, and we thought, all right, let's go get these other people. And we were able to interview, as you said, the president of the school at the time, Mary Sue Coleman, and the AD, and Perry Watson, and the son of Ed Martin, the surviving son of Ed Martin.
Yeah.
Who was at the center of that scandal. So Chris, it was a good lesson for life in general, but specifically for my career and what I do for a living, that just because someone says no, it doesn't mean the project is over. You just have to adjust, and sometimes it can even be improved. So
then you do the Fab 5 and 11, Bernie and Ernie and 13, and then you go for the 85 Bears, which is the story of that 85 Chicago Bears team. You could argue it's the best football team of all time, but it's kind of the story about the team and Buddy Ryan as well. The relationship that Mike Singletary had with Buddy Ryan. He visits him on his ranch. What made you want to single out Buddy Ryan in that scenario? That I have to give credit to Dan Hampton for that, and to Singletary himself, because he agreed to be that much of a part of the story. But Buddy obviously was always going to be a big part of the story. But the fact that he was so sick and literally couldn't speak anymore, we couldn't interview him, and he still wanted to be a part of it somehow. So Dan Hampton, after we interviewed him early on in the process, I got home and I had no sooner dropped my bags and my phone rang in my apartment. And I picked it up and it was Dan. He said, "Hey, Buddy wants to be in this, but the problem is that you can't talk to him. So what if Mike Singletary went to visit him in Kentucky?" Because I just talked to Singletary and he hasn't seen him in a while. I think they knew that Buddy was going to pass away soon. So they were saying their goodbyes while he was still around. And Singletary agreed to let our cameras be there. He flew in, shot with us for a few hours. We had lunch and then he flew out. But that just shows you that you have to have a plan going in. But if
if you have to deviate from it, then you have to adjust on the fly. And that oftentimes those deviations improve the final product. And that was a good example of that.
Yeah, things can change and on a dime, like you said with the Fab Five, and you get Chris, and you have to pivot and stuff like that. So you then go to work with Bill Simmons, who created 30 for 30 on Andre the Giant for HBO. What was behind telling that story? I mean, Andre is a mythical figure, and that's probably one of the best documentaries I've seen. I mean, that OJ Made in America, and we've only seen 2 parts of The Last Dance, but I would imagine that that'll be up there. But talk about Andre. What made you want to tell that story?
Well, at first I didn't, because I'm not a big wrestling guy. And Bill is. And he had wanted to, when he created 30 for 30, that was on like the top 3 or 5 that he wanted to tell. And I think they could just never figure out a licensing deal with Vince McMahon. You'd have to ask Bill the specifics of that. But I think that was the major roadblock. So he called me. We knew each other because I had done a short for Grantland when he was running Grantland, and we just had mutual friends, and I knew him as an acquaintance. And he called and asked me if I'd be interested. And of course, I'm going to pick up the phone and say I'm interested. It's HBO where I used to work, so I knew a lot of people there, and I respect Bill tremendously. And he said, I thought he'd want to treat these wrestling matches as if they were real games or events. And I didn't feel like recounting, when Andre won the title and pretending that these things are real, because, I didn't think that the WWE would be willing to, tear down the curtain and say, this is entertainment and let's tell the story of this guy's life, not Andre the Giant, but Andre Rousimov. What was it like for him to navigate the world as a 7-foot, 500-pound man in a world that was not made for him? And they were on board with that from the get-go. I met with McMahon twice before we were greenlit, and he said that he wouldn't want to insult the audience's intelligence and pretend that these things were real. So, telling the story of the match with Hogan and how they choreographed that's what I was interested in, is how do they choreograph these things? How are decisions made? And then also the rise of the WWF at the time, now the WWE, in the territories and kind of taking over the territories. It sounded to me like something that was like a scripted film that I would watch. So to be able to talk to so many of the people who actually lived through it, the timing worked out. I actually started working on this Jordan project before we signed the deal to do Andre. So I was reading every Jordan book I could get my hands on and preparing to do this, because this Jordan thing was supposed to air at this time in 2018 for the 20th anniversary, actually in June of 2018 for the 20th anniversary of that 98 team. And that's how long it took to get everybody to the table. I finished Andre, which took over a year. And when I came out of that, they still weren't done with the deal. So the timing worked out for me to when they did sign it, to go right into this from Andre.
So you said you go right to Jordan. How was assembling your team based? Like, how did you put your team together for Jordan?
Well, we had a very lean staff. It was me and a couple of producers for Andre. And I did a lot of the editing on Andre myself. And then a guy named Harris Mendheim came in for the last couple of months and spiffed everything up and did a tremendous job landing the plane. But I was trying to keep it bare bones, because we were the budgets were good, but they're not great. And if you have a huge staff, you're not gonna take much home, and the people working for you aren't going to either. So we wanted to keep it lean. And so those key members of the Andre team, of course, if you say that you want to do a Jordan doc, then they're going to be all in. And then I leaned on, you mentioned OJ, I leaned on Ezra Edelman is the director of that. He's a friend of mine. And he recommended the producer, Nina Kirstich, who is the archival producer. So every frame of footage that's not an interview in the OJ doc, she found it, she got it. And she's literally the best in the world at that job. So we got her for Jordan because we had a deal with the NBA to use game footage, and they have their own librarian, but there's a ton of other footage that we needed to find. And it's really tough to scour the earth for this stuff and to find it. So if you want, it's one thing to get Scottie Pippen college footage, which is hard. Dennis Rodman college footage. It's another thing to go abroad and get Tony Kukoc footage from when he was 15 years old. So she was perfect for that job. And then I wanted to work with editors I hadn't worked with before who had not worked in the sports space. Because to me, this story was about much more than sports. It was about the rise of celebrity, and it was mini documentaries about all these guys' lives. And I wanted them to come at it with fresh eyes. Everybody knows who Michael and the Bulls are, but I didn't want a sports nerd because I felt like so many things would fall through the cracks that we took as a given that the average viewer at home wouldn't know. And many times the editors would say, well, you know, why would they fire Doug Collins and hire Phil Jackson? I thought that Doug Collins just brought them to almost to the finals. Things like that we take for granted as sports fans or as fanatics with that story. These guys came at it with fresh eyes. So it took a while to build that staff. And we have a dozen people on there. It's the reason why we're watching it on Sunday nights right now is because that staff is so good. They finished this movie from their apartments.
Well, yeah. I mean, how difficult has it been, you know, especially with the pandemic? I'm not sure if you guys were finished, but if you are putting finishing touches on, I would imagine that it's tricky, especially now.
Yeah, we went from a multi-million-dollar facility with state-of-the-art rooms and you know, the final sign-off on the color correction and audio mixing, which is the last two steps of the entire process for each episode. That used to take place in a theater that was housed in the building where we edited this thing. We had 5 or 6 offices, and then the other wing of this building had a legitimate like private theater. So you could watch it and the sound is booming in from all directions and the colors are up there. The screen is huge. And that's how you sign off, with a notepad just sitting there, and they feed you all kind of, you know, fancy desserts and stuff. And there's like a drink cart. It's really like luxurious. That's like the finish line. Well, now we're doing that from laptops, and these guys are doing that at home, and they're sending me files that take hours to download because they're so rich, the sound and the picture quality of them. And that's how I'm signing off now. So everything has just been scaled way down, and that's where it's like, it's not the tools, man. It's whoever's using them, and that's how you can separate, you know, the good people from the great, and the people who are on this thing are great, beyond great, and they've managed to do this on machines that are not built for making global 10-hour documentaries, and from hard drives and emails and Zoom meetings and, you know, text chains and email threads. They've managed to actually land the plane.
So yeah, the first 2 episodes were captivating. I watched it live on Sunday night and watched it Monday the next day. I just can't get enough. Talk about your first interaction with Jordan and how has he been throughout this process. I mean, for him, it can't be easy to do this, and talk about how he's been.
First interaction with him was at a hotel in Midtown. His manager called me almost a year after when I started initially talking to his camp, which is only a few people. They put me in front of him, and it was kind of like a video game where you have to beat all the henchmen and then you get to like the big boss, you know. And I had met with the NBA and ESPN people I knew, and Netflix, met with them. And there were so many people, so many hoops to jump through. And then finally it was like, all right, Michael wants to meet you to give final sign off on if he's comfortable with you telling the story. So we met for like an hour and just kind of talked about, I just wanted to gauge how willing he was. It's not like I would have said no matter what. I wasn't ever going to turn the project down. I would have been really disappointed if he was really guarded and said, these are off limits. But if you get a chance to sit down with him for a couple of hours and interview him, and at that point it wasn't supposed to be 10 hours. So I figured we could do more with less. But he was right from the get-go really, really open and really willing to go places that I thought would take a long time to get him to go to. He was bringing up things like his Hall of Fame speech and some of the more controversial aspects of his career and how he's perceived and how he felt about how he's perceived. So, and he's been tremendous. He was contracted for 2 interviews. He gave us 3. So we got a few hours more out of him than we expected to get. And now that we're all in quarantine, he is too. So he's watching rough cuts and he's giving notes and feedback. He's been everything you would want. You wouldn't want someone who is so involved that they're overbearing, and you wouldn't want certainly someone who's going to censor the content because they're afraid of how it's going to be perceived. He's been neither one of those. And I give him tremendous credit because it takes a lot of guts to show yourself like that. And he has not once said, take that out because it's unflattering. There are unflattering things in here, but I think with context, he can explain why he acted in certain ways. So I give him a tremendous amount of credit for never dropping the hammer and telling us that we couldn't do anything we didn't want to do.
Yeah. I just want to segue to your film style. So in the first episode, you show Michael watching on an iPad of his mom reading that note from when he was a freshman, I believe, about the stamps and having $20 in his bank account. What made you want to do that specifically? I found that extremely fascinating.
Well, he doesn't know me. So we're not going to have that rapport. If I tell him, hey, I talked to your mom and she said this, it's probably going to elicit like a polite, yeah, she's a great lady kind of response. So I wanted to bring the people who were speaking about him into the room as much as I could. It reminded me when you played that radio clip before of how now I'm on the other side of that, because I didn't know you were going to play that. And he didn't know that I was going to play him, something from his mom, or even more interestingly, as the series develops, something from Isaiah or from Gary Payton or from Reggie Miller. And in the end, there's a big one at the end in the final 10 or 15 minutes of the film. So I just wanted him to hear it straight from whatever horse's mouth was telling the story, to get his immediate reaction. So you could see him actually watching this thing as it develops. He's never seen these clips before, and he did not know that I was going to show these clips at any point. And it was just a good tool to keep him interested, because he's been asked every single question you could possibly think of. But I was trying to think of a way that I could ask these questions in a way that he has not heard them before.
I thought that was interesting. It was a really good trick. I saw it and I was like, that's kind of, you don't see that in films and documentaries and stuff. And you've talked about how you're going to take a break from sports docs for now. What's next for you?
A nap, man. A nap and a cold beer. I'm not really sure, especially in this climate. Like I have no idea when planes are going to be back in the air regularly and people are going to be able to go on a set. Thank God we finished shooting when we did. We shot our final interview right as the country was going into lockdown. Things were getting bad in Seattle and New York. Yeah. And we had to shoot in Spokane with John Stockton. And that was, I want to say like March 11th or maybe March 10th, whatever that Tuesday was. And I couldn't even go to that because ESPN was afraid that the country would just fall off a cliff and be locked down and I'd be stuck in Spokane, and I needed to be back in New York finishing this thing. And then a week later, we were kicked out of the offices. So everything happened really, really quickly. Today is actually the first day that I've had no work obligations since January 2018. So wow. I took a nice long nap before I got on here with you. I had to do some errands around the city and then took a nap, and that's what I'm going to be doing for the foreseeable future. We still have work to do on this thing. Editing is done, but we still have finishing work to do. And then after that, I'll just kind of sit back and see what opportunities are out there and where we want to go next.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for meeting with me. I know you're the center of the sports universe at the moment. So thank you so much for meeting with me. And it's been a pleasure meeting you.
My pleasure, man. Likewise.